Hello, this is Dr. Christian Lehman, and welcome back to reading the Victorian novel, A Tale of Two Cities. Today, we are going to talk about the third monthly installment. So this is in August of 1859, and it covers Book 2, chapters 7 to 12. As a summary, this week covers week 9, chapters 7 and 8, Monseigneur in town and Monseigneur in the country. In chapter 7, it's a long satire of the aristocracy, and the Marquis is spurned. Chapter 8, Monseigneur in the country. The Marquis is named Evremont, and whoa, surprise, he is Charles Darnay's uncle. Week 10 was a one-chapter week, The Gorgon's Head, and in that, Jacques assassinates Evremont. Week 11 contains chapter 10, Two Promises, which are that Manette will hold Darnay's love secret, and then Darnay will tell his name on his marriage day, clearly setting something up. Chapter 11, a companion picture to this, Stryver tells Sidney that he is in love with Lucy. Then in week 12, we have the Fellow of Delicacy. Stryver is discouraged by Laurie from pursuing Lucy, and the Fellow of No Delicacy. Sidney loves Lucy, but would make her life miserable. So as you can see, we have these kind of two very different things happening. We have the French plot, in which we are assassinating the aristocracy, and we have the English plot, which is the traditional marriage plot. So we're picking up, though, with the thing that connects them, which is sex. So this is about the Monseigneur. This is the political satire, and Monseigneur is not an individual, but rather is a type, the aristocrat who is losing power. And this is the passage. As to finances public, because Monseigneur could not make anything at all of them, and must consequently let them out to somebody who could. As to finances private, because farmer generals were rich, and Monseigneur, after generations of great luxury and expense, was growing poor. Hence, Monseigneur had taken his sister from a convent, while there was yet time to ward off the impending veil, the cheapest garment she could wear, and had bestowed her as a prize upon a very rich farmer general, poor in family. So this is a very common theme, one with which I think everybody is familiar, but the idea that you have a family of a famous name, good breeding, quote unquote, old money, and they are getting poor. But then you have this new generation of new finance tech bros, in this case, tax collectors, these farmer generals, and they're extremely rich, but they don't have a good name. So they want to marry somebody, like marrying a Kennedy. And here it operates around like the Monseigneur takes his sister from a convent, right? A place where she would have pledged herself to virginity, and has bestowed her using that patriarchal language in order to benefit himself. Hence, this use of the word prize right there. It's important to understand the Marquis. He's a figure that is just under the Monseigneurs. So we have a hierarchy here. And what we're going to see happen is he is spurned. And so he in turn acts out this feeling aggression on those younger than him or lower class than him. Not many people had talked with him at the reception. He had stood in a little space apart, and Monseigneur might have been warmer in his manner. It appeared, under the circumstances, rather agreeable to him to see the common people dispersed before his horses, and often barely escaping from being run down. His man drove as if he were charging an enemy, and the furious recklessness of the man brought no check into the face or to the lips of the master. The complaint had sometimes made itself audible, even in that deaf city and dumb age, that, in the narrow streets without footways, the fierce patrician custom of hard driving endangered and maimed the mere vulgar in a barbarous manner. So a lot of things are happening here. One, we have the anxieties of the Marquis that remanifest themselves against those lower class, right? Hence this movement from Monseigneur to the common people, which even down to the vulgar. We have this idea of enacting your frustrations through violence that happens here, but it's a transferred violence, right? The Marquis has his servant, who's the driver of the chariot, of the carriage, do these things. And then lastly, we have a comment that this is the mere vulgar, right? Those are the common people. But the narrator says this is done in a barbarous manner, so an uncivilized manner. So we have a few different elements, like the Marquis, the Monseigneur, they think they're the height of civilization, but the way they act, as the narrator makes it clear to us, is barbarous, so lacking in civility. Here's the illustration for this, just to look at it quickly instead of holding off to the end. The Marquis ends up driving over a child. Here is that child there, looked over by these kind of four cupids. There's the driver, at least expressing some shock. The Marquis not caring at all. In this corner, we have Madame Defarge, and then there is Defarge himself. This tall figure, and I love the way we see his height through the bent knees, right? That's the only reason he's lower than Defarge, is Gaspard. Behind them are the towers of Notre Dame. And so there's this sense of the church looming behind them, kind of judging, not necessarily, maybe even in some ways supporting these class differences that happen. All right. Now I want to look at the start of chapter 8. And here especially I want to pay attention to the idea of the Dickensian parenthetical. So Monsieur the Marquis in his traveling carriage, which might have been lighter, conducted by 4 post horses and 2 postilions, fagged up a steep hill. A blush on the countenance of Monsieur the Marquis was no impeachment of his high breeding. It was not from within. It was occasioned by an external circumstance beyond his control, the setting sun. Here, of course, we're using atmosphere to build up a few different elements, right? The sun is going to turn red. It's going to turn his hands crimson. And then that's like the blood on his hands. But what I'm really interested in here is the parenthetical. The carriage, which might have been lighter. So it operates in 2 levels. One, it's a critique of Monsieur the Marquis. He overweighs this light carriage for the horses. So there's too much in it. But then plot-wise, it also might have been lighter because, as we'll learn, Gaspard is clinging to the bottom of it. So a lot happens in the Dickensian parenthetical, and I just want to encourage people to pay more attention to them. Chapter 2-9, one of those 1 chapter a week chapters, is titled after a classical allusion, the Gorgon's Head. It was a heavy mass of building, the chateau of Monsieur the Marquis, with a large stone courtyard before it, and 2 stone sweeps of staircase meeting in a stone terrace before the principal door, a stony business altogether, with heavy stone balustrades, and stone urns, and stone flowers, and stone faces of men, and stone heads of lions in all directions, as if the Gorgon's Head had surveyed it when it was finished 2 centuries ago. So the Gorgon's Head here is the myth of Medusa, who so Medusa was a beautiful woman. The god Poseidon, called Neptune in Rome, raped her, but he raped her in a temple of Athena. And so Athena, Minerva in Rome, destroyed her beauty, turned her hair into snake locks, and anybody that she looked at would turn to stone. So there's a lot of different interpretations of this, but that's the basic myth with which Dickens is working. The Gorgon, though, is also another kind of figure in mythology, which is just a general monster. And in fact, at the end of book 11 of the Odyssey, the Gorgon is the last thing that is seen as Odysseus leaves the underworld. It's this like frightening presence that terrifies in the underworld. And in a lot of ways, right, the land of the Marquis is itself a kind of classical underworld. So this use, though, of Gorgon, and specifically the rape myth, is what's going to be important for the character development of the kind of analysis and critique of the aristocracy that Dickens is about to enlarge upon. So here I want to offer a content warning of sexual violence around the passage that the Marquis was going to phrase. So he's talking here to Charles. Our remote ancestors held the right of life and death over the surrounding vulgar. From this room, many such dogs have been taken out to be hanged. In the next room, my bedroom, One fellow, to our knowledge, was poignarded on the spot for professing some insolent delicacy respecting his daughter. His daughter! We have lost many privileges. A new philosophy has become the mode, and the assertion of our station in these days might, I do not go so far as to say would, but might cause us real inconvenience. Oh, very bad. Very bad. So, it's important that, again, in a parenthetical, the Marquis is telling us that this event happened in the bedroom, which opens up the setting to the space of sexual encounter. And he's saying that a person was poignarded, that is, stabbed through with a sword, because he expressed an insolent delicacy respecting his daughter, repeating his daughter. So this insolent delicacy is that the Marquis wanted to rape this woman. And this fits into a pattern of behavior that appears periodically called the jus primi noctis, or the droit de seigneur. So the first is Latin for the law of the first night, and the second is the right of the ruler. And it refers to the right of a ruler to have sex with any woman in his kingdom, especially a virgin woman on her wedding night before she has sex with her husband. So this is what the Marquis is saying happened. He was trying to rape this woman, and her father interrupted, resulting in the father's death and the likely continued sexual assault of the woman. And the Marquis is complaining that people would complain about him doing this. And that's the new philosophy that is coming about. So a few different elements, right, that are at play here, but it all connects kind of earlier to this idea of the Marquis taking his sister out of the convent, right? The patriarchy getting to control female sexuality. It's also important because what we have here is the relationship between a father and a daughter, set in France. And there's only other father-daughter combination is Lucy and Dr. Manette, Alexandre. And in the chapters to come, it's going to all be about Lucy's sexuality, as we have three different men enter to try to claim their reason to be with her. And so it's really a complicated move that Dickens is playing with here on the ideas of gender and sexuality and the patriarchy and violence that he's kind of weaving together in these parallels between France and England, high class and middle class. So that phrase, the new philosophy, right, that's going to be really interesting as the kind of articulation of the change between the aristocracy that's now poor, but has a good name, to the moneyed rich, to just the common people, and how for the rich, the common need to be ruled. So this is in fact political philosophy. And there's a few things to really emphasize and remember here, which is this novel is written in 1859. So the Second Italian Revolution is happening. The novel is about a French Revolution, and it's set in 1780 after the American Revolution. So it really is a book right in the middle of the age of revolutions. And those revolutions are largely being driven by political philosophy. Figures you might have heard of: Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. These are all mixed in with this. And the Marquis is very firmly set on the rights of the ruling class. "Let us hope so," said the uncle. "Detestation of the high is the involuntary homage of the low." So that's his first idea. And in articulating this idea that the lower classes should hate the upper classes, and that is in fact a form of homage, comes directly from not a great Roman emperor named Caligula, who has said in a famous tag, "Oderant dum metuant." Let them hate, provided that they fear. So this idea of ruling through fear rather than through respect. And then the Marquis continues, repression is the only lasting philosophy. The dark deference of fear and slavery, my friend, observed the Marquis, will keep the dogs obedient to the whip as long as this roof, looking up to it, shuts out the sky. So here is philosophy, right? People lower than him are dogs, right? He completely dehumanizes. He picks up this language of slavery, which I think is going to tie into another event that's happening, right? Because in America, it's gearing up towards the Civil War, something that Dickens is kind of fully aware of. But notice that like hitting that language of philosophy, the Marquis has now used it twice. Dickens is layering this engagement with philosophy pretty heavily. In fact, he wanted it to be very clear. So this quote that I'm about to read, this comes from Sanders's Companion to a Tale of Two Cities. In a letter to Bulwer Lytton on the 5th of June, 1860, Dickens defended his juxtaposition of the Marquis and his nephew as embodiments of contrasted social philosophies. Quote, with the slang of the new philosophy on the one side, it was surely not unreasonable or unallowable on the other to oppose a nobleman wedded to the old cruel ideas and representing the time going out, as his nephew represents the time coming in. And then he quotes the none such letters, which is difficult to be a pilgrim. Darnay's new philosophy combines the Anglophilia of the last phase of liberal thought before the Revolution with its stress on the liberty of the citizen and the longer established teachings of Diderot, Voltaire, and above all, Rousseau. Darnay shares with these thinkers a distaste for privilege and an awareness of newer kinds of obligations shared by citizens abiding by the emergent social contract. So that social contract, that's the ideas of Hobbes and Locke that's coming forth. And it might be that like one of the reasons why Darnay is in England is that's what he's picking up, because you'll know he's spending time in university circles as a translator. So he's being surrounded by these kind of new ideas, even though we might not see that on the page. That idea here that Dickens says of the cruel ideas may be a hint of Hobbesian men are cruel and greedy and selfish. So the Marquis continues, my friend, I will die perpetuating the system under which I have lived. When he had said this, he took a culminating pinch of snuff and put his box in his pocket. Better to be a rational creature, he added then, after ringing a small bell on the table, and accept your natural destiny. Oh, but you are lost, Monsieur Charles, I see. This property and France are lost to me, said the nephew sadly. I renounce them. Are they yours to renounce? France may be, but is the property? It is scarcely worth mentioning. But is it? So here the Marquis hits this language of systems, the philosophical of rational creature and natural destiny. He picks up on those social contract languages in order to emphasize the difference. So people that were philosophizing about the social contract, right, were trying to talk about all people created in a certain way, having certain rights, particularly Locke rights to life, liberty, and property. So, and then the rational creature, that comes out of Rousseau. But the Marquis takes these words that are really powerful at the time, immersed in political philosophy, and he's applying them to perpetuating his system of inequality. Then we have this idea of property, which Darnay claims he can renounce, but of course, the Marquis responds, it is not yours. All right, here's a confusing slide, but essentially it comes from the class I was teaching. We are transitioning to talk about the later chapters in this monthly installment, which is all about Lucy. And we open kind of after Charles trying to get the two promises right with Dr. Bennet, and Lucy comes back. She has not been present. The key thing about these is that when Charles confesses his love, he does it to Dr. Bennet. When Stryver does, he does it to Sidney and Laurie. Only Sidney actually talks to Lucy. And this is Lucy coming home. It was dark when Charles Darnay left him, and it was an hour later and darker when Lucy came home. She hurried into the room alone, for Miss Pross had gone straight upstairs and was surprised to find his reading chair empty. My father, She called to him, "Father dear." Nothing was said in answer, but she heard a low hammering sound in his bedroom. Passing lightly across the intermediate room, she looked in at his door and came running back frightened, crying to herself, with her blood all chilled, "Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" So what I want to emphasize here is that what this shows is Lucy being excluded from these conversations that are about her future. So we have the chapter of the Marquis removing his sister from a convent in order to marry her off. And then we think, oh, horrible, horrible, horrible. And now we have this passage where men are talking about Lucy, but not to Lucy. And she's being kept out of these rooms. And that's kind of what gets emphasized here. The aloneness that she's in and not knowing what to do, right? Like almost asking, like, what is the power that a woman has? This is how Charles declares his love. "Dear Dr. Manette, I love your daughter fondly, dearly, disinterestedly, devotedly. If ever there were love in the world, I love her. You have loved her yourself. Let your old love speak for me." So he seems to emphasize the reason he loves her is because he's seen her love for the doctor. He's seen her loyalty and love. There's nothing about her personality or what he likes about her. He even alliterates himself, which shows maybe a lack of off the cuff thinking. It's not an awesome statement. Here is Stryver's love. This is to Sidney. "I feel that it is a pleasant thing for a man to have a home when he feels inclined to go to it. When he doesn't, he can stay away. And I feel that Miss Manette will tell well in any station, and will always do me credit. So I have made up my mind." Here's Stryver saying in that parenthesis, he can run around and not go home, whereas he would not allow the same thing, right? So there we have some double standards, some gender inequality that Stryver takes for granted. And he's just like, hey, I think that she'll do well in the station and will do me credit. He is looking for a trophy wife, right? He's been around, he's seen her, and he's just like, well, that works. And then there's Sidney's love. The only one, again, of the three to talk to Lucy. "If it had been possible, Miss Manette, that you could have returned the love of the man you see before yourself, flung away, wasted, drunken, poor creature of misuse as you know him to be, he would have been conscious to this day and hour, in spite of his happiness, that he would bring you misery, bring you to sorrow and repentance, blight you, disgrace you, pull you down with him. I know very well that you can have no tenderness for me, and I ask none. I am even thankful that it cannot be." So pretty self-abusive here, what he's saying, but he's like, hey, I love you, but I would bring you nothing but misery, sorrow, and repentance. So I'm not going to pursue you, but just know that I love you. Kind of manipulative, I think, because he's also like, you make me want to be a better person. And that's a lot of pressure to put on her. So I'm of two minds here, right? At least he's talking to her, but what he's saying is a lot of pressure. I also realize that I'm not giving her space of her response, and in so doing, I am silencing her. All right, a quick addendum on some racism. So Sidney wears these wet towels, which on the bottom paragraph here, back in the previous installment, sullenly enough, the jackal loosed his dress and went into an adjoining room and came back with a large jug of cold water, a basin, and a towel or two. Steeping the towels in the water and partially wringing them out, he folded them on his head in a manner hideous to behold, sat down at the table, and said, "Now I am ready." So carrying in our brains this idea of the manner hideous to behold, the narrator now says about them, Sidney was none the livelier and none the soberer for so much application. It had taken a deal of extra wet toweling to pull him through the night. A correspondingly extra quantity of wine had preceded the toweling, and he was in a very damaged condition, as he now pulled his turban off and threw it into the basin in which he had steeped it at intervals for the last 6 hours. So here the narrator chooses a word that he orientalizes, thinking of the kind of use of a turban there. So if we remember that he found that hideous to behold earlier, we have that racial application to populations that wear turbans for religious and cultural reasons. And Sidney thus is also further othered, along with his alcoholism being tied to the use of the turban. So to the illustrations quickly, here we have Mr. Stryver at Tellson's Bank. large presence. He's got his stick. Here's Laurie bent over, the crowd in the back. His elbow on the desk, a point straight out of the text. But then let's jump to John McLennan. Here in Monsieur in Town, we have the illustration of the older woman wanting there to be a burial marker for her husband. And here we kind of see it manifested, but this idea of like Christ sacrificing himself. And we wonder what kind of society is that as it looks down over the marquee at the bottom. Then he also illustrates in this really kind of impressive effect, Gaspard shrieking. Notice the effect of the wind blowing back his hair and the belt kind of flowing in a backward motion. About this first image, right, McLennan likes using images late as his frontispiece. We're going to see that again later on. Here we have the Gorgon's head. We have the window with some ivy. There's a singing songbird there. Not really anticipating what's going to happen in this particular one, but he depicts the dead Evremond with the knife through his chest, drive him fast to the tomb, and the note tied to it. Very, I think, impressive work on that stony face, capturing the pointed nose that is so emphasized. The natural world flowing over here to the painted screen is also a nice touch. Then chapter 10, the two promises. Here we have Lucy outside of that door, right? Kind of being excluded. Being excluded from what? This conversation between two not very great portraits, one of Charles and one of the doctor. The Charles almost holding the doctor's hand in the more romantic gesture, kind of highlighting Lucy's poor empty hands as they do not communicate. Then the fellow of delicacy is Stryver, which is right here. I love this detail of putting him on the platform. He's quite a bit more portly, but still leaning that one arm on the desk. And there is Laurie, looking quite a bit older than in Fizz's. And again, McLennan using a later image here, the fellow of no delicacy. So this is Sydney talking to Lucy, right? And two of them in the same space, also on the same level, which I find to be an interesting choice. The last thing I want to talk about here is I've been really wondering what degree of influence is McLennan having on Fizz? So McLennan has to produce works every week, and Fizz just has to produce works at the month. And so I don't think that there's actually the influence happening, but I don't know. I can't find any letters that say maybe Dickens giving advice on what it should be, but it seems odd that they would both pick this kind of image so strikingly. So McLennan's comes out on July 23rd, 1859, and by July 30th, all the year round, advertises the publication availability for the monthly number. And so that's right here. So in all the year round, on the number 14 on page 336, this was on July 30th, 1859. It says, now ready, the third monthly part, which would have included this image. And so that seems like not enough time for Fizz to have seen McLennan's and then produced it. But there's something going on with the relationship between these two men. And so I'm hoping to keep exploring that with you. So with all that said, we have come to the conclusion of this month's installment, and we look forward to the developments as next time we start knitting.